Hello YouTubers and welcome to the JK Lenses review of the Nikon 105mm f2.8 AFS VR macro lens. As always, this review is in 4 handy sections. After running down the specification and checking on the handling, we look at its optical performance and then run our eye over some possible alternatives. This lens is from a long line of high quality Nikon macro lenses, spanning both manual and the various generations of autofocus, culminating in this AFS version with vibration reduction technology as well. Although it might not seem much nowadays, the major highlight of this lens is the fact it can focus all the way from infinity down to a distance of just 31cm, where it achieves a true macro 1:1 reproduction ratio. In other words, the image on your sensor is exactly the same size as the object in real life. It does this whilst maintaining full metering and autofocus, and doesn't even need to change its own length in order to do this. Not too many decades ago, an optical achievement like this would have required extension tubes, bellows, and all kinds of related ironmongery. The only slight downside is that the lens's fast f2.8 maximum aperture decreases slightly as you approach these very short focusing distances, and by the time you get down to about 31cm, the real maximum aperture will be somewhere around f5. Providing these macro facilities without even needing to flick a switch obviously requires some optical gymnastics inside the lens, and consequently the lens is a very solid tube of glass containing 14 elements in 12 groups, with one element made of Nikon's special low dispersion ED glass and one space age nano coating. The lens is by no means large in size at 110mm long, but in common with many of Nikon's professional lenses, fills out to a full 83mm in width all along its length. Although despite this, the front element is surprisingly small, taking only 62mm filters. The lens weighs in at a noticeable 750 grams due to its metal construction and expensive glassware inside. Despite the complicated optics going on inside, a guided tour of this lens really doesn't take very long at all. In common with most of Nikon's professional lenses, it has a rubber weather sealing gasket around the lens mount. And moving forward along the metal lens barrel, we come to the lens's control panel of 3 switches. The top switch moves the lens between manual and autofocus. In the M position, the lens behaves entirely like a manually focused lens, and the MA position engages the AFS autofocus system. In this position, the lens is focused by the camera's autofocus sensors and its own silent wave motors, but they can be instantly overridden by simply holding and turning the large focusing ring. Given the incredibly wide range of distances on which this lens can focus, we're not too surprised to find a focus limiter as the middle switch. When this switch is set to the left, the lens can focus anywhere from infinity right down to its amazing close focusing distance of about 31cm. In the right-hand position, the lens can only focus down to a distance of about half a metre, which can obviously speed things up for the autofocus system when you're not too bothered for close-up work. The bottom switch simply turns on and off the first generation red logoed vibration reduction system, with its ability to allow you to get sharp images when shooting up to 3 stops beyond normal hand-holding speeds. Moving forward past the focusing scale, we come to the very generously sized focusing ring. Unlike most AFS lenses where the focusing ring is a 1cm wide afterthought, the wide focusing ring on this lens is very much one of its highlights. It covers almost a third of the lens's length, has a very light action, and is an absolute pleasure to use. This is excellent news in a macro lens where very precise focusing is absolutely essential. The focusing ring is also linked to one of the downsides I've found with this lens over the years. Although the focusing is normally very speedy and accurate throughout this very wide focusing range, my copy does seem to struggle sometimes when switching between macro subjects and those at a more usual distance from the lens. In particular, if you've been focusing on objects very close to the lens and then ask the AFS system to focus on something say 10 feet away, the lens will basically just park itself at the closest focusing distance of around 31cm, and no amount of tapping the shutter or the AF buttons will induce it to move. In practice, this problem is easily solved by turning the focusing ring to move the focusing distance out to a few metres, where the AFS system is happy to pick things up and finish the focusing. However, as we've often said on this channel, the speed and accuracy of the autofocus system is a combination of the lens and the camera body, and as someone who uses a D3S camera body pretty much all the time, this is absolutely the only lens where I've ever needed to override the autofocus system. If this is a feature of the lens rather than a fault with my particular copy, then the switch that allows the AFS system to only hunt between infinity and 0.5 metres makes a lot of sense as it gets around this problem. A bit of asking around and nosing about on the internet suggests that this getting stuck at the closest focus distance might be a feature of early examples of this lens, although a bit of research on the excellent photosynthesis website suggests this probably isn't the case for my lens. This lens has an interesting history in that for the first 3 years of its manufacture it was built in Japan, but all subsequent lenses after about 2010 have been built in China. Although my lens is a made in Japan example, its serial number beginning 333 suggests it was built a good 3 years or so into the lens's history. The other slight peculiarity of the focusing of this lens is that it suffers from focus breathing quite noticeably. Focus breathing is when the size of the image on the sensor changes depending on whether it's in focus or not. This happens to a certain extent with almost every lens, since obviously any out of focus image is going to take up a little bit more room than its in focus version. However, with the 105 f2.8, this effect is very noticeable indeed, and although it's not the end of the world, it's something that needs to be borne in mind when composing photographs with this lens. Unfortunately for a macro lens, this effect increases as the distance between the lens and the subject gets smaller, to the point where objects are almost halving in size as you focus on things at the minimum focusing distance. As this isn't a zoom lens, this can be a little bit awkward, as it may mean you have to keep manually adjusting the distance between the lens and the subject. It also means that this may not be the ideal lens for shooting videos. The other handling feature which you'll notice when using this lens is its incredibly thin depth of field. This is by no means a failing of this lens, it's a feature of all lenses that focus at these incredibly close distances. Although in normal photography we think of the aperture as the major determinant of the amount of depth of field, when there's less than half a metre between the camera and the subject, then the amount of depth of field shrinks dramatically. To show this effect, here's some attempted product photography on my TV remote control. As you can see, shooting at an everyday aperture like f5.6, the depth of field is only really about one button in width, which can be far from ideal for a whole range of subjects. Working at these kinds of shooting distances with any lens, you'll often find yourself having to stop down to f11 or f16, in this case to get the whole of the number pad sharply in focus. And if you want to get the whole of the frame in focus, then you'll often be heading down towards the camera's minimum aperture, which in this case is f32. This explains why almost all macro lenses have a minimum aperture of f32, rather than the more usual f22. This picture kind of illustrates two related handling issues to do with using almost any macro lens. And if the 105 f2.8 is to be your first step into macro photography, then they're definitely worth thinking about beforehand if you want to get the best out of the lens. If you've been looking at my remote control picture and thinking why don't you get the camera parallel to the keypad, that'll solve all your depth of field problems, then you've definitely understood the first challenge which a macro lens like the 105 might pose for your existing camera equipment. Placing a large heavy DSLR body and lens parallel to a tabletop is a definite test of the gymnastic abilities of almost any tripod, making it almost impossible to achieve unless you can get the object right up against the tripod legs. Some higher spec tripods will allow you to swing the centre column out to solve this problem, but the best solution is a tripod that's been specifically designed to do this. The one pictured here is my old but trusty Unilock 1600 tripod, which when packed up looks rather like 4 large golf clubs in a bag. Its design allows you to put each of its 3 legs at all kinds of bizarre angles, and as you can see, its centre column is just as happy sliding horizontally as it is vertically. This means you can easily mount your camera and lens horizontally, and you can even use a spare pair of binoculars or a bag of shopping as a counterweight to keep even the heaviest camera bodies stable. The second problem involved in having the camera and lens working so close to the subject is that they can often be blocking out a lot of the light that would normally be falling on the subject. Poking the head of a normal flash gun in between the camera and the subject could often be only a partial solution, as it will inevitably create very strong shadows which may be far from ideal. Back in the olden days of film photography, an excellent solution was Nikon's SB29 ring flash, which as its name suggests was a large ring-shaped flash tube which mounted around the camera lens rather like a filter, and produced a wonderfully even light coming from all directions at once, which was just perfect for all kinds of tiny things very close to the camera lens. With the move to digital sensors, Nikon dropped that approach, although some off-brand manufacturers still make ring flash units that will work with Nikon DSLRs. Nikon's current solution to the lighting of tiny macro subjects is their wireless close-up flash system. As you can see, this consists of a number of little wireless SBR200 flash units, which can be placed around the lens or around the subject to suit pretty much any macro lighting situation. The kit comes with a circular bracket which fits onto the lens's filter thread and allows for up to 8 SBR200 flash units to be fitted around the lens. This can obviously be used to simulate the wonderfully symmetrical lighting effect of a ring flash, but the SBR200s also come with little stands, which means you can place them anywhere around your subject that you like. One of the beauties of the system is it's completely wireless, so there's absolutely no wires between any of the flash units and the camera. But this does mean that my photograph here isn't quite complete. To tell your little tribe of SBR200s exactly when to fire, you will need at least one flash unit which can work in commander mode. You can buy an SU800 commander unit as part of the kit. This looks rather like an ordinary flash gun that's had its flash tube removed, mounts onto your camera's hot shoe, and will allow you to control all the little flash units wirelessly. However, a number of Nikon's ordinary flash guns can work in commander mode and can therefore also be used to control the system. This is the system I use, with my SB800 providing some background lighting and wirelessly telling all the SBR200s exactly when to fire. In addition, many, although not all, of the pop-up flash units on some Nikon DSLR camera bodies can also be used as a wireless flash commander for this system. This system isn't cheap, but can certainly solve the quite specialised problem of getting perfectly even lighting onto a subject which has the camera and the lens almost on top of it. Having passed through the problems of focusing support and lighting that come with macro lenses, we eventually arrive at the front of the lens, with its 62mm filter thread and deep reversible lens hood. As you might expect from any lens with micro Nikkor on the side, standards of optical performance are extremely high. This lens can trace its heritage back to optical designs which set industry standards for image accuracy. So as you'd expect, standards of sharpness are extremely high right across the FX frame, and levels of resolution are well above anything required by a modern DSLR sensor. Colours are always very faithfully reproduced, and levels of distortion are effectively zero. If I'm in a particularly bad mood, I can sometimes convince myself I can see a little bit of darkening or softness in the corners at f2.8, although I couldn't actually find a real photograph taken by this lens to back this up. The bokeh, or the appearance of the out of focus areas of this lens, is never a problem, as it always appears smooth and fairly natural. Although if you like your backgrounds totally smooth and completely blown away, then you can see why f2 and f1.4 lenses are also popular at this focal length. When backgrounds are complex and or close by, this lens does a good job but isn't always able to isolate its subject totally from the background. As always though, the USP with this lens is that it can deliver these excellent optical standards with objects which are barely a foot away and produce images which are actual life size. If you're thinking that a 105mm f2.8 macro lens might be just the thing for the kinds of pictures that you're trying to take, then in this section we look at some alternative paths to achieving this. If you're attracted by the optical quality that this lens can produce, then it's important to realise, as with many Nikon classic lenses, that it's been available for many decades. As always, there are AIS manual and first generation autofocus or AFD versions of this lens available. Many experienced macro photographers actually prefer manual focus for this kind of work, and therefore the AIS version is very much the equal of the more modern version we've been reviewing here. When you look at their relative prices though, there's some very serious value for money to be had in the manual version of this lens. This point can be clearly seen in the second-hand prices of the AIS versions of this lens. Even though they may be nearly 40 years old, you absolutely never see them at giveaway prices given the 21st century quality that they can produce. The AFD version carries on the tradition of outstanding optical quality, although it's not quite as whizzy to use as the modern AFS version. In addition, despite their lower price, the manual AIS versions of this lens have full metal, last-a-lifetime construction, which is not something you find on the modern AFS lenses. If you run your eye down the latest prices for these three versions of this lens, then it obviously beggars the question, what value does all this extra money for AFS and VR bring you? That's actually a really good question for an awful lot of Nikon's current lenses, and particularly so for a macro lens. An awful lot of macro photography is conducted on a tripod using flash or long exposure times. Although I guess that you could argue that the modern lens with AFS and VR allows macro photography to kind of shake off these restrictions and become much more a handheld kind of walk-around activity. The argument about why pay so much money for the AFS version of a lens is a point that's come up many times on this channel, and I guess at the end of the day you'll have to make up your own mind on this point. However, before giving it a rest, there's a couple of things I'd like to point out. Firstly, for the 200mm macro lens, Nikon don't even bother to make an AFS version, and secondly, as someone who's taken thousands of pictures with the 60mm f2.8 AFD macro lens, I'm clearly not the only one who can't see any advantage to the AFS version apart from a much higher price, as Nikon keep both the AFD and the AFS versions of this lens in current production. Once you've decided how much money you'd like to spend on taking life-size macro photographs, don't forget to give a bit of thought to whether the 105mm focal length is the right one for you. If your subjects have got legs or wings and are likely to run a mile at the sight of you with your macro lens, then Nikon produce a lens which can do everything which the 105 f2.8 reviewed here can do, but with a much larger working distance between the camera and the subject. This is the legendary Nikon 200mm f4 AFD macro lens, which is used by some of the world's top macro photographers. If you were thinking about saying, but it hasn't got AFS or VR, then you can jolly well go and sit on the naughty step for 10 minutes. As a bit of a footnote, we can't really finish this section without mentioning the Tokina 100mm f2.8 macro lens. Although I've never used one, there's a great deal of opinion on the web that suggests it offers similar optical quality to the Nikon lens at a much lower price. Consequently, it would be very much worth a second look before you part with your hard-earned cash. There's no doubt the Nikon 105mm f2.8 AFS macro lens does exactly what it says on the tin and can get the job done at extremely high quality. However, the JK Lenses conclusion would be to look very closely at the features that you're paying for with this lens, as Nikon solved this particular optical problem some decades ago. I hope you enjoyed this video and found something useful in it. If you've got any comments or questions, then please type them in the box below. And as always, very many thanks for watching.